Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome CEO of the Milken Institute, Michael Clouden.
Good afternoon. It's been an incredible 2 days, 3 days for some of you who are at our private sessions, and we, as always, are saving among the very best for last. But before I get us started on our concluding panel, there's one very, very important thing that I want to do and ask you to join me in doing. This great event was put on by the wonderful staff of the Milken Institute, primarily the Milken Institute Asia Center, with great assist from our folks in our events department, development department, the Vision Matrix people. If you've had a good time, if you found it worthwhile, please join me in thanking all of them for their work. And with that, let us get started on our closing plenary, bookending the conference, Jobs of 2037, Preparing for the Future, Looking Forward 20 Years, and it's moderated by our chairman, Mike Milken.
Good afternoon, and I think as many of you know, 2017, the theme of the Milken Institute Global Conferences around the world and other programs and our efforts has been building meaningful lives. And the challenge we have as we look to 2037, with the world's population probably going to increase by as much as another billion people on the planet. What will they be doing? What are the opportunities? What will they consider to be meaningful lives? And so this is our theme for this year, and it's one of the great challenges as we look forward. If we could pull up slide 36 for a moment as we think about these issues, and you can ask each one of you, what is a meaningful life? And for many of the millennials today, it is far different than it might have been for their parents or their grandparents. Slide 32, when we address some of these issues, in 1982 there was a book written by John Nesbitt called Megatrends. And in the second chapter of the book, he talked about the challenge of high-tech, high-touch. And as technology was being deployed, this principle symbolized the need for balance between our physical and spiritual reality. And in a book last year by Tom Frieden, he pointed out in interacting with the Surgeon General of the United States when he asked, what is the biggest disease in America? His response was, no, it's not cancer, it's not heart disease, it's isolations. It is the pronounced isolation that so many people are experiencing that is the great pathology of our lives today as we think forward. And so as we think about these issues, there's no better place in the world to turn to than Singapore. And it was a number of years ago when I first came here in 1972 to meet Lee Kuan Yew. And a number of years before that, he was focused on what's the future. He looked a lot younger when I met him the first time. But what's the future of Singapore? And he actually traveled to Jamaica to meet with the leaders in Jamaica and asked them, what's your strategy? And so Singapore and Jamaica had about the same per capita income at that time in the beginning of the 1960s. Well, Jamaica's strategy, he was told, their strategy would be tourism and agriculture. Lee Kuan Yew's strategy was human capital. Educate your own citizens and invite and attract the best and brightest from around the world to come to Singapore. No one today would confuse Singapore and Jamaica, as per capita income in Singapore is more than 10 times Jamaica, and Jamaica doubled their per capita income, and it took them more than 50 years. Whereas Singapore increased its per capita income 25-fold. So If we're going to study this issue in the future and what are the opportunities and skills, we are in the best place in the world, Singapore, to address that issue. And luckily, we have the best person in Singapore to address that issue, the Minister of Manpower, who's also interacted and been in charge of the labor union interaction, education, etc. So Josephine, can you give us any insights we should be thinking about?
Thank you very much, Michael, and I'm delighted to be able to join this for the concluding panel for this Asia Summit of the Milken Institute. I wanted to start by just making 3 points, and then we can elaborate on each of the points. The first point I want to make is that when we think about the future, what we know does sound very scary, very frightening, but the outlook for jobs is not all gloomy. That's the first point I want to make, and I'll elaborate on it a little later. The second point I want to make is that we really need businesses to take the lead to transform, and there is a role for government, and that is primarily in helping citizens to adapt to the transformation that is needed. Again, I will say more about that. The third part, interestingly, Michael, relates to the point that you used right at the beginning of the session, which talks about the meaning of life. I think that the amount of upheaval that we can be expected to have to deal with, both at the enterprise level and also at the individual level, will create many instances of stress for both businesses and also for individuals. And what we really need is to cultivate a sense of solidarity, a sense of solidarity that we are in this together. And again, I'd like to be able to say more later. But back to my first point, that what we know about the future certainly sounds very frightening, but the outlook for jobs is not all gloomy. If I could have just the first slide, and I think that was slide 85, Sean, if you could just pop it up. Now, I'd just like to say that improved longevity is one reason why the global population will still grow. But it is also why having more people does not automatically mean that we will have expanding workforces. In fact, the working age share of population is expected to fall marginally, and in advanced economies like Singapore, we could expect a sharper decline. And for us, it will go from 72% to below 60% among the resident population. And except in the developing world, shrinking workforces everywhere else will put a drag on economic growth. And of course, we already know that there is going to be the relentless pace at which technology will change how we manufacture products, deliver services, and create enterprise value. I think Sean has a slide 19, which shows that of the 11 companies here, I think a good 7 to 8 of the companies that are top companies by market capitalization, they did not exist before 1975. And no business, I think, should believe it can avoid riding the bumpy waves of digitalization and still stay afloat. But I still do believe that we don't know enough of the future to conclude that the jobs outlook is all gloom and doom, because a very often asked question is whether robots will put millions of workers out of work, as if disruptive technologies lead inevitably to disrupted livelihoods. The truth is probably not quite as we imagine it to be, because although there's no doubt that advances in artificial intelligence and machine learning will increase the prevalence of workplace automation, it is probably true that at the level of tasks, many routine tasks will be automated, but it's hard to imagine jobs completely automated away. This is also consistent with a recent study that the OECD made. So if you take a look at this is already what has happened. 60% of the jobs in 1950 were unskilled. Today, that number is 12%. And look at the number of skilled jobs that have gone up. It's gone from 20% to what it is today, 70%. And if you project it into the future, for the vast majority of jobs, human beings will likely still be needed, although the use of technology will intensify. And you could call it tech and touch. So for example, you may not have marketing in the way it was done before, but you have digital marketing. So even as routine tasks are automated, we possibly can have knock-on effects and new jobs being created. And if the past is any guide to the future, in fact, technology has always created a net addition of jobs. And in more recent times, new job roles have emerged. We've never heard of people who do cybersecurity, but now we do. And if you just take e-commerce, brick and mortar retail type of jobs have gone, but in the whole of the supply chain management, you have many more new jobs. So there is, however, a catch, and that will lead me on to my second point. The catch is that the prospect of a net addition of jobs is comforting only to the extent that the workers involved can find ways to access the new opportunities. Otherwise, it is a very frightening thought. And you could have a very unhappy situation where unemployment is rising, and yet at the same time, businesses are growing below potential. So the second point that I said earlier was that we need businesses to lead in the transformation and governments to help in the adaptation. For Singapore, I think there are two other factors that shape our response to the potential impact of technology. The first is that we have an imminent slowdown of workforce growth, and that's because we have smaller cohorts coming of age, baby boomers retiring. We have an already high labor force participation rate and moderated inflows of foreign manpower. Second, for us, there is a risk that productivity and wage growth will stagnate, especially in the domestic-oriented sectors. So if you think of it against this background, in Singapore certainly, we have a very real interest in helping businesses to be more productive and manpower lean, and it is also essential to their continued success in Singapore and their ability to provide better jobs. What do we do with the people who are displaced? Well, I think we have to help them adapt, and there is no running away from helping them to acquire the skills that will help them to access these new opportunities. So I'll keep my remarks here, and then we can come back and talk about the third point I made, which is how to cultivate this sense of solidarity. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So first, Jaime, I want to congratulate you on being named the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals Pioneer this week. So congratulations. You're the first, I believe, to ever be recognized from the Philippines for this award. And second, you are the head of a company that was founded in 1834. So as we think back over those centuries and your family and what's occurred, obviously your workers are substantially different today. And as we saw in China, the drop-off in working age population at this time, that is not the case in the Philippines. And so the Philippines brings us one of the youngest populations in Asia. Yeah. Talk to us a little bit about the challenges that you see, and maybe contrast a little bit Philippines with its very young population and China.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Michael. And I think the challenges that we all face as these job revolutions take place will be as challenging, obviously, in countries like ours as they are in the developed world. We're all going through massive shifts, but it is an interesting time for developing countries like ours. Per capita income is way below, say, for example, Singapore. But as we look at the problem, as they say, it sometimes depends on how you look at the issue at hand. There is a lot of focus right now in the Philippines on the jobs that will disappear, and I'd like to focus instead, and I think I take a page from Minister Teo on the issues of how the nature of jobs will change. And if maybe we can go back to that slide 20, maybe as a start, and start by focusing on the issue of median age. You look at the Philippines on the chart, and our median age is pretty much the lowest on the list. And to a certain extent, I think it's all about taking advantage of a possible demographic dividend rather than see this as a problem. Now, if you don't address it properly, obviously, you've got a lot of young people coming into the workforce. It's an opportunity, but can also be a problem if not tackled properly. If we go to the next page, I think slide 21. It's an interesting slide because on one hand, the Philippines is high on the digital leader platform and also high on the super cities leaders list. I used to look at density in cities as a negative, and over time I've realized that the big cities, if handled correctly, can be catalysts for great innovation. There's a lot of cross-current learning that takes place. Young people, academic institutions, the workforce, all huddled in a close area. If handled correctly, there's a lot of unique discussion that begins to take place. You take that with a young population like the one we have and their ability to adjust very quickly to changing technologies, and you have a possible positive catalyst for change. I think it's no accident that we became a leader in the outsourcing space. It's a young population. They're willing to adjust. Their cultural affinity to the US and the UK, their ability to speak English well, adjusted very quickly. And I think the kind of jobs that have taken place in that space, I think people think are still on the low end. People have been used to seeing the Philippines as a call center. It's already evolved into a much more complex space. People have built up skills in equity analysis, CAD/CAM design, healthcare, and many others. And so what you've had is a mirror image of our service industry abroad being reflected locally because of the shift that's taken place in telecommunications and bringing those jobs back to their home country. That, combined with a young population, has really made the Philippines a very unique place as a catalyst for adjustment, I guess, in this new digital age. I think if we go to slide 21, it was just following the order they were in. And then 22. Well, we talked a little bit about the high literacy rate and the affinity to the US, and I think one more slide forward. Going back to the history, I guess, of the institution, Michael, that you mentioned, you've seen here that the services component of our economy has been growing rapidly, and agriculture, which was the traditional business of our country back when our family business started, has begun to decline. It's just amazing how our young population has taken on to the service industries, and a lot of it has been helped by this telecommunication revolution that's taken place that's managed to relocate services to our part of the world. India, of course, has also profited a great deal from this, but it's just amazing how we've adjusted to it. I think the challenge is, as we go through the changes taking place, the use of artificial intelligence and how the BPO industry is changing, is to keep adjusting the skill set of the country. And one issue I wanted to put on the table, Michael, is it is now more important than ever for the educational institutions and industry to talk. Generally, educational institutions and industry have not always conversed properly. We have produced students following old schools of learning and old ways of getting degrees. I think the fast changes taking place now on the industry front require us to really have consultation in a much more serious way between industry on one hand and the educational sector. I think the whole issue of technical skills and of a workforce beginning to adjust, even as high school graduates, to the needs of these new economies that are shaping up is going to be more important than ever. I think in a country like ours, a developing country, because of our demographic situation, high urbanization, the mix of ideas, and an ability for young people to take on technology easily has really created a new atmosphere of entrepreneurship, willingness to take risks, and a changing nature in the way people are looking at jobs. So even a country like ours, I think, if the right direction is set, can evolve and survive and maybe blossom in this change that's taking place.
Thank you very much. And pull up slide 50. As we look at these challenges to the future, I think the minister pointed out something really interesting. It's not just that people don't have jobs, but it's also the jobs that go unfilled and the matching of skills. And what that does is it reduces the growth of businesses, industries, by not being able to find qualified workers or being forced today to go overseas. Many of the issues in the United States today are not to go overseas for lower wages or pay, but to look for qualified workers. And as we look at just 10 areas that potential disruption and innovation, I just want to highlight one before I go to Joe here. And that would be agriculture, number one on the list there. So if we look just at the history of the United States and evolution of agriculture, we have a country that in 1800, 98% of the people in the entire country lived on farms or were involved in agriculture. 100 years later, we were down to 42%. And then 100 years later, we were down to 2%. And as you look at scientific breakthroughs today, just even increasing the power of the sun can increase output by 15%. And new technologies that exist can further increase output, reduce the use of water by 50% at this time. So I'd like to just show a couple second video here of potentially the future of farming from a warehouse in China. Let's take a look at that video.
The Chinese government has been funding scientists like Professor Yang Qichong to research vertical farming.
由于在可控环境下进行生产，所以它的空气环境也是比较亲切的。我们能做到不用任何农药和化学制剂。
Here's how it works. Seeds are placed in sponges and grow up to 17 days. Then the plants are moved a few feet away to a nursery area, and finally into a finishing area where roots dangle in beds of fertilized water until the produce is ready for harvest.
Because our container is climate controlled, it allows us to do a full harvest 26 times a year. And a typical farm can only rotate their land anywhere between 4 to 6 times.
So the change in productivity, etc. Now, Joe, in many ways, your company has been one of the great creators of jobs in the world over the last decade. So it's not only creating direct jobs, those working for Alibaba, but the potential for small and medium businesses throughout to distribute their products, drive their products, etc. How do you look at the challenges in China for your own employees, and how do you interact with those small and medium businesses to sell their products?
The common understanding of e-commerce is that it replaces or destroys a lot of jobs in the real sector of the economy. If you look at the United States, I think the retail segment has been losing jobs. But China is a little bit different in a couple of respects. Number one, the jobs, job in the retail sector is not a very well-developed sector. So there's not a lot of big retail footprint in China. When you go to a fourth-tier city in China and you go out into the streets, you would not be able to find quality products. And sometimes the products on the shelf are not even real. They're counterfeits. So that's the reason why e-commerce grew very, very fast. So instead of replacing jobs in the real sector, our perspective is that e-commerce actually created more jobs. The second phenomenon is that China, being the manufacturing base of the world, has been a huge export economy in the past 20 years. But more recently, since the financial crisis, the Western markets have consumed a lot less. And what happens is that there's a lot of dislocation in the export sector. So manufacturing jobs, you would think that manufacturing jobs would be lost. But what's happening is these manufacturers are starting to look inward into the domestic market, try to access domestic Chinese consumers instead of exporting their products. So in the factories, even though I think overall China probably lost something like 8 or 9 million manufacturing jobs last year, it would have been a lot worse without e-commerce because the export factories would just shut down and without access to the domestic consumer market. All right.
Could you take us one level farther? So not just Alibaba. How does Alibaba, if I'm developing a small business, I have my products, how do you interact with them to let them know in your stores or your ability to distribute that they can tie into your distribution system?
The small business are typically very nimble, and they learn faster than big businesses. That's what we found. So it's easier actually for us to onboard a small business on our website. And when you're a small business owner, you have a product you want to sell, they would over time, as they scale their business, they want to find new sources of product, new factories. And we have an ecosystem that helps them do the sourcing. In the onboarding front, they would need to hire people to develop their web presence and also digital marketing, from the traditional marketing to digital marketing. If you're selling apparel, one of the most common jobs now in the online apparel sector is people who will model your clothes. Literally billions of photos are being taken every year and being posted on the Alibaba website, and now more so on the mobile app, so that people are, the models are showing the clothes.
Did you talk to Naomi Campbell about this issue?
I was thinking about that. I was thinking that, while I was on stage during lunchtime, I thought to myself just now that you're working me overtime. And if you find me repeating myself, I need a new audience, if you got the joke at lunchtime. But anyway, yes, but as you set up a web presence, there are a lot of jobs that are being created. And then e-commerce, you would think, is just a website, right? But it's not. It's about getting the product to the consumer, to the end consumer. So logistics is very, very important. And we all know that in the logistics segment, if you build warehouses, you need people to work in the warehouses for fulfillment. And then you also need to ship the product to the end consumer, so you need to have delivery. And the Alibaba ecosystem supports about 2 million people on the streets making deliveries day in and day out. We generate about 55 million packages per day on our platform that need to be delivered. So that is an ecosystem that is supporting all the employment. And the delivery guys, a lot of them have come over from the manufacturing sector. They were working in factories. As the factory jobs scale down, the delivery business goes up in employment.
So I think one of the keys here, to underline what Joe has said, is that the use of technology and distribution, Alibaba, mobile apps, etc., is a way that small and medium businesses, which create most of the jobs in the world, can tie into a distribution system that you have built. And they don't necessarily have to have 20 stores to distribute their product. They can tie into this distribution system. And when you think about where these jobs are created, you could just look back at the United States. And during the period of time between 1970 and 2000, let's take the latter part of the 20th century, you had 62 million jobs created by small and medium businesses, and -4 by large companies at that time. And so in many ways, by building your distribution system, you've afforded many, many small businesses an opportunity to succeed, whose expertise is designing or manufacturing their product, and you are the end source distribution for them. I want to shift a little bit here to WorldQuant and Igor, if I can. Unlike most companies in the world, you've already had to deal with the technological changes that have occurred in building your business. What lessons have you learned in designing WorldQuant that other companies need to learn or that you could pass on today in a world of technology?
Thank you, Mike. The lessons I learned are many, but the main lesson is that the world is changing at exponential rates. So many things are growing exponentially. Data is growing exponentially. Computing power is growing exponentially. Knowledge is growing exponentially. And this creates a lot of growth opportunities. And what I've seen inside WorldQuant is nothing but growth. Headcount has been increasing since day one. It's continuing to increase. And we see no sign of any kind of job destruction internally within the company. And the main lesson, if I have to say any one thing, is In this new world, you have to set audacious goals. You know, we generate something called trading signals. We call them alphas. And we had one alpha in 1995. We had 150 in 2007. We had 1 million of them a few years ago. Now we have 6 million. By the end of the year, we're going to have 10 million. And so as you set these goals, you have to make sure that they sound a little bit crazy. Otherwise, you're not participating in the new age.
I think, Igor, one of the other elements is that I know you've taken the view, unlike many other companies, that the intellect and talent at the highest level is evenly distributed throughout the world, so that those with the highest IQ aren't dominated in any one part of the world. How have you been able to put that to work?
It's fairly simple. We go all over the world, we open up offices, and we hire the best and the most intelligent people that we can. Other than that, we are location agnostic in that a researcher working in Moscow is doing the same things as a researcher working in Beijing. And we have some, management layers and management techniques designed to make it all seamless. So the offices and people operate independently. Once every 2 weeks, we have something we call the Keystone Forum, where the whole company gets on a giant video conference and we all get together and we speak to each other. It sounds like it should be chaotic, but it's actually a pretty good thing. So I think one of our key competitive advantages is the fact that we're able to reach out throughout the world, and we're able to get the best talent, because talent is distributed equally throughout the world, but opportunity is not, and we arbitrage this gap.
Thank you, Igor. Josephine, I'd like to go back to you, and you raised an interesting issue on how can businesses and governments better prepare the workforce? How can they work together? It is estimated in the United States that there are potentially 50 to 70 million jobs in technology and other areas that will go unfilled due to the fact that the population is not prepared or educated in this area. And I know from early child care on in the country that there's a focus in this area and a focus on retraining. Could you talk a little bit about that and what suggestions? We have people from more than 20 countries here today that you could make for government leaders, business leaders in this area.
There are many different kinds of companies. Some companies are in very competitive, internationally oriented sectors. And almost certainly the pressures of competition creates an internal impetus for them to innovate, because if they don't, then tomorrow they may not be around. But you showed very interestingly in an earlier slide that if you look at the amount of job creation, it isn't just the big companies. It isn't the companies that are out there at the frontier that are creating jobs. In fact, a lot of jobs are created by very small companies, micro enterprises, and actually enterprises that in many parts of the world don't have a governance structure, don't have proper systems, processes in place, and actually may not be able to grow much bigger than when they first started. And that's something important to bear in mind, that when we think about businesses transforming, it isn't just the businesses at the frontiers of their various industries and sectors that we need to take care of. It's actually the vast majority of the smaller businesses who have difficulty appreciating all the time what's going on and how they need to adapt. And so in the case of Singapore, the way we think about it is that it's so much easier for the businesses to transform if you recognize the fact that they're part of industry ecosystems, and there needs to be momentum in the industry ecosystem. In other words, other people are changing, platforms are changing, industry rules are changing, and so when you are part of that ecosystem, very naturally you have to adapt along with it. And that's the approach that we've decided to take. What we've done is to say that you want your people to adapt, but in what context do they adapt? They can only adapt to the business transformation that is going to take place. There is no point in asking people to prepare for the future by being trained in this kind of skill or that kind of skill if those new skills that they get trained in don't eventually land them a new job. That's something that we have to bear in mind. So, but how to land a new job, that starts with how the businesses are transforming. So the approach that we're taking is that we say each sector is going to have to transform differently, and you have to create a different kind of momentum. What we've done is to join hands with the stakeholders, mainly the industry players, to chart what we call the industry transformation maps. So it could be transportation, it could be maritime services, it could be the finance sector, it could be healthcare, it could be retail. And we want to be able to say, how will the business look like in 5 years, in 10 years, and what kinds of things need to happen in order for you to raise productivity and infuse the way in which you operate with more innovation. So productivity, innovation are key themes in the industry transformation maps. Another very important part of the industry transformation maps is what kinds of skills will you need your people to do differently? Will you need your people to have? Now, so that's the part that concerns the businesses, concern the industry. Then you need the other part, which is how can you get hold of the individuals and design interventions that will target those who are at risk of being displaced, and then to organize the training so that they would be able to access the jobs that are being created or the jobs as they are being transformed. So a couple of years back, we decided that it's a very interesting point that you suggested earlier. I think it was a slide that has to do with the returns of investment on education, how that's shifting to preschool, and once you enter the workforce, it gets increasingly difficult.
So this is a slide work that was prepared by Jim Heckman, Nobel Prize winner, University of Chicago, that pointed out that, one, it's depressing, but by the age of 5, you can identify who will be able to compete in high school and afterwards. And so what his work showed was the most important period of education in terms of the highest rate of return was basically 5 or 6 or younger. And you needed $3 at 15 years old to get the same return as you do at 5, and you need $5 at 22, and you need $10 at 30. And Singapore has been a leader in early child care education. And what's so interesting is China, not based on the work of Jim Heckman, Nobel Prize winner. I know when I first visited and focused on China and education more than 20 years ago, the cost of early child care education was 4 times the cost of college. So in the United States, the cost of college was 4 times the cost of early child care education. And so this investment in youth, both in Singapore and China, was obvious from that point in time.
But Mike, I think part of the reason the returns on job training at an older age is so low is that very often the training is not tied to the needs at the workplace. Very often the training is not related to what the person actually has to do. And that is exactly the point that we are trying to change. So we have not given up on job training for adult workers.
Okay, well, we obviously, I would say, we can't afford to give up on job training because the skills change so quickly today. And I think I just want to emphasize the point you had made. This is really a partnership of business and government to understand the mapping of jobs from that standpoint. I mean, a lot of people come from different parts of the world and they say, well, they're dealing with a different workforce or the people have different goals. Describe to us, since you're in so many businesses, what is, and since the median age in the country is 24, what are millennials thinking about today And how does that contrast, let's say, from 20 years ago for your employees?
I think the changes, Mike, have been tremendous. I think millennials these days, from what we've seen, we're a company that basically gives employment to about 35,000 people directly, and of course there are many others that surround that. But the way they look at jobs is far different to my generation. Essentially, they're comfortable moving from job to begin with. Number two, there are spaces in social media now that allow them to look for opportunities to join projects and use specific skills they have for the projects that are needed at a specific point in time. And that flexibility is something that they value. They like to be challenged, they're quite values driven, and they like to work for institutions that have a broader meaning or a broader goal that goes beyond, I guess, the return on capital that many managers are trained to just focus on. So that flexibility, that desire and willingness to move, even in the Philippines as a country, we have a large workforce that's even comfortable moving abroad and seeking employment where their services are needed. That flexibility is something that was unheard of before and should be adjusted. It goes head to head a little bit with the rigidity of some of our labor structures in the country, both at the policy level and even in the corporate sector. We've tended to see the whole issue of employment in a much more rigid way when we should be adjusting it to the needs of this community, which actually would create a more exciting environment for the workforce. But following that issue, I wanted to mention two things, Mike. One is taking on from an equation that you showed us earlier that you worked on in your youth about the whole importance of financial intermediation in creating a platform. A country like ours, and perhaps an emerging country like the Philippines can be a proxy for other emerging countries, the whole issue of access to capital for people at a certain income bracket is almost zero. There's still many unbanked members of our community. And very recently, for example, we tied up with Alipay, a sister company of Joe's, to start developing very quickly a platform using the skill set that Alipay has built up in China to get microloans and payment systems at a different price point to a broader community in the Philippines. Ideas like this, empowering people who've traditionally not had access to financial services, giving them microloans and giving them access to a financial system, is a key component of getting them to enter the general economy. And I think that whole issue of how it revolves around entrepreneurship and how it encourages it is going to be, I think, one major element to getting employment at the entrepreneurship level moving in the future. And so that whole broadening of the engagement of low-income groups in getting access to capital is an important one. The second idea came from a slide you showed us earlier, Mike, about the changing nature of jobs. I looked at your slide on urban agriculture in a setting. You take a country like ours, and this is a raw idea. We've had a long history in the semiconductor industry. We've had manufacturing plants used to enclosed spaces, low bacteria count, and manufacturing in a very rigid form for the electronics industry. It is the largest export in the Philippines, I think, still. So that skill set is there in the workforce. If you were to take the nature of that job and swap it and move it to urban agriculture, perhaps that's a thought of a changing nature of a skill set that could be applied. And why do I say it would be relevant to a country like ours? The logistics that Joe was talking about that works so seamlessly in a place like China, it's much more difficult in a country like the Philippines. We have 7,000 islands, and the whole logistics sector is still very underdeveloped. Getting agricultural products from the mountain down to the city is an expensive proposition, and in many cases it takes days and it's difficult. Why would urban agriculture in a controlled setting, using the skill set we built up in the electronics industry, not be a possible solution? But that would take a major change in mindset on that workforce and the people who fund those industries, and shift it using new technologies that take place to an urban environment. There's density, but perhaps that density could be an advantage if you take advantage of the marketplace there and use new skills, new ways of preparing food in an urban setting that would basically bring down the cost of transportation. I'm not saying it would be a solution for all types of food products, but certainly for vegetables and some of the ones shown in the video, it could be. And I think we're going to need that type of imagination in figuring out how existing jobs could also be shifted to ones that have potential for the future.
Well, thank you. We're excited that we're now here that Allah is about to go into new businesses. So distribution, changes in retail, the largest company in the world in terms of number of employees, Walmart, 2.5 million, concerned about what Amazon was doing, went out and bought Jet.com. Let's take a look at that video for a second.
The old economics of saving money meant you had to buy items in bulk. And that's weird. Because 5 pounds of mayonnaise is actually a fundamentally ridiculous thing to buy. When you're done with it, you can live inside the jar 7 years from now. That's how long it's going to take. Jet.com is transformationalizing the shopping club. So now you can buy human-sized mayonnaise and millions of other human-sized things at teeny tiny prices.
So that is an effort, not necessarily how Walmart might have been presenting itself, to address some of these issues. And as Walmart is grappling, I think this underlines the challenges for many of the world's largest companies. They've now suggested they might be using drones today to respond to the comments of Amazon. And they've applied for patents now on floating blimp-like warehouses. So your warehouse is just going to be floating in the sky, and they're going to hover above that, and then they're going to be delivering to you from those blimps up above those deliveries. So those warehouses that we talk about, let's take a look at a warehouse today that actually exists.
This is a grocery warehouse. We service grocery stores with dry goods items. We receive directly from the manufacturer and stock items and then deliver them to the stores by their request. So if we received in coffee, it would be not just a case of coffee, it would be a full truck of coffee in pallets. We'd take those pallets, load them onto conveyors, and then the first robot would take that pallet apart layer by layer. And then those layers would then be broken up into single case quantities and then stored within the structure by the next set of robots. We'd then receive the customer's order, and they would give us an order for coffee, and then for peanut butter and mayonnaise and whatever else they wanted. Those cases would then be retrieved by the bots and then brought out to a third set of robots, which would then build the customer's order in a pallet to their specification. People do not handle the product in the automated system. On each shift, we have 5 to 6 associates out on the floor that are monitoring the system and there to resolve any issues that come up and keep the lines running. It's running essentially 20 to 21 hours a day and 7 days a week.
So 4 to 5 people working in a warehouse backing these up. Now, Joe, you have new distribution systems. You call them dark rooms versus the front of the house. And so you're changing in many ways. Goods are distributed. You spoke about an army of 2 million people delivering 55 million packages a day, but you're also attempting, not necessarily in blimps hovering over sky, but in physical buildings, delivering goods and services. Could you talk about that for a moment?
Logistics is a very complex topic. And the warehouse that we just saw is probably, as I look at it, a wholesale warehouse in the sense that the consumer or the small business is buying in volume. So once you get into what we call the B2C warehouse, the complexity goes up. In other words, the packages are being fulfilled and packed in that warehouse going into individuals. But you know, what's happening right now, especially in the grocery space, is that distribution is changing, and the new ways to distribute groceries is disrupting these large warehouses that are located probably outside the city outskirts. What's happening in China today is that stores double as a warehouse. So you can have a store that can serve walk-in customers, but then, as you mentioned, there's the dark part of the warehouse where you can fulfill online orders. So you may be in the store today, but tomorrow you're sitting at home or in the office and you want to order something online. You whip out the mobile phone and you order online, then they will fulfill from the same location as the location that you just walked in yesterday. So that kind of architecture is very disruptive to the large warehouse architecture. It's going to change the way real estate developers develop their cities and malls. And that's what we are pioneering in China. We can locate our stores with the dark part of the store within the 3-mile radius of the consumer, and we promise 30-minute delivery, which is something that cannot be done through that warehouse that we just saw. So there's a lot of innovation just in the logistics space. The key thing is we're changing kind of the architecture of the logistics network, and what that means is the prior investment in the old architecture will have to be scrapped and new investments will have to be made.
So Josephine has to leave for a very important meeting with the government here today, and I just wanted to ask you one more question before you left. As you look at the separation between companies and industry and government, is there a separation of responsibilities to the state where these are the responsibilities of government that could enhance the opportunities? How do we create, let's say, reduce the fear in workers over the future of their jobs?
That's a great question.
And where does the responsibility of the company itself begin and end?
Yeah. I'm so glad you brought it up, because when you talk about the transformation that is needed at the levels of businesses and industries, some of it is very daunting. So what you potentially could find is pushback. And where will the pushback come from? The pushback could come from the people who are affected. So if you're a taxi driver, you really don't like all these third-party hailing apps because it's disrupting your livelihood. And so you have a tendency then to raise the issue with the government and say, you need to put a stop to this because this is very harmful. And actually, there are many cities in the world where third-party ride-hailing apps are technically not allowed to operate. And yet, of course, we know because of the tremendous benefits that accrue to the commuters, people find a way to use them anyway. So this is where governments potentially could get caught. On the one hand, you have people who are affected by the change, and they say, we want protection from the change. And yet, at the same time, you know that unless you are able to allow the businesses to develop new models of operating that are more efficient and that will exploit their potential to the fullest, you don't actually have the opportunity to create better paying jobs for the people, your citizens. And I think what the government needs to do is essentially a couple of things. One is that in terms of the rules, you have to be willing to re-examine them, and you have to make the rules facilitative. In other words, they need to be able to enable innovation. That's the first thing. Second, governments have a huge responsibility to their citizens to help them to adapt to the change. And that means essentially providing a sense that there is a way in which you can access these new opportunities through training, and that you would also have to look at the social security, whether that is adequately going to support them going into the future. And I think the third thing that governments can play a positive role in promoting is the point that I made earlier, which is to cultivate a sense of solidarity. And what do I mean by that? It cannot be that the future is about businesses winning with technology and innovation at the expense of their people. Neither can it be that the future is about people getting more protection against disruption at the expense of new business models. Now, the only way in which we can make forward movement is if both businesses and people are prepared to say that we will win together because we're in this together. And the only way in which you can do that is if you promote the sense of solidarity and really, in the process of change, ask ourselves how you can strengthen the partnership between businesses and the people sector, and also to make sure that everyone has a stake in a successful future. I think if we were to be able to do that, then when we talk about jobs of 2037, preparing for the future, it will be a future worth working towards.
Well, thank you very much. And I think so succinctly you've addressed the issue. The going to the government to protect themselves against competition or change has occurred for hundreds or thousands of years. And we look forward to Singapore showing us the way in this area. And it was no different when the mobility could not compete with the merchant class in England. They went to the king or the queen for protection. And I think addressing this issue and using it in the form of ride sharing was a great example. And certain countries, as you know, and cities have at the moment provided protection. Long term, that won't work. And so really, thank you for your participation. I know you have to leave, but we're going to go for a couple more questions, so please feel free.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And I hope you have a fruitful discussion. Thank you very much. Just a quick shake of hands. Thank you.
So Igor, I was trying to think of how I could show the audience how you use technology that has disrupted in many ways traditional money management, or as we see more and more hedge funds or others trying to develop algorithms or quant to figure out what to do. So I was thinking about basketball and how you've somewhat changed the rules. Let's take a look at this video. So we've noticed here that being able to use two hands at once gives you a lot more shots at the basket. But I think it's easy to talk about technology and change, and it's easy to say you have offices all over the world. How do you coordinate the work? What have you learned by having an office in Bulgaria or an office you've just opened in Singapore? How do you focus on quality of work, time of work, and even what is a work day or a work week look like today?
Well, I think coordination is achieved largely through a very good incentive system, which makes people self-govern and self-direct. What's the effect of a work week and a work day is that we don't really even measure them. We measure only productivity. We measure how much somebody produces. So with improvements in technology, speeding things up, and amplifying human ability, it's possible to produce more and more with less and less time. And we welcome that as long as it, the net effect is positive. So it's like we have 3 or 4 arms, as in that video.
As opposed to the 2. I understand. So if I could paraphrase for the group today, what you've really said is you've looked at the output of the employee or the partner, not necessarily how many hours they've put in, but you're focused on the output and the quality of that output. Is that a fair description?
That's correct.
So I should tell you a brief story, which I will, about Einstein. And so there was a reporter many, many years ago who said, Einstein, you're one of the most creative persons that ever lived. Could I follow you around and see how you get these ideas and what you do and your creativity and innovation? He said, sure, it's kind of boring, but you can follow me around. So she had breakfast with him, stay with him during the day, and she noticed that he never had a pad to write anything down. So she said to him after a week, you don't write anything down. Where's your pad? How do you write your ideas? He says, you don't get unusual ideas that often. and when you do, you remember them. And so it wasn't, to paraphrase what you said, it wasn't the number of hours that you put in, but the output and the creativity from that standpoint. So in closing, I just want to leave a point that I think is very important, since our effort this year has been so focused on building meaningful lives, and the opportunities and the challenge of the Singapore Summit this year is, what is the world going to be like in 2037? And I wanted you to listen to the minister today, because Singapore will, once again, in my opinion, shine the light for much of the world on that. The cooperation of government and business, the responsibility of business, the fact that the government is thinking about what the industries or businesses of the future will be. But one thing we should remember, that when I go to bed at night, makes me feel good and think, is that for most of the people on this planet, today was the best day of their life. And as we think about 40% of the children that live in China and India, those in Indonesia and so on, or those in East Africa or Sub-Saharan Africa, these are the best of days. Healthcare, reduction of disease, access to the world through smartphones or mobile phones. Today, 84 or 86% of Sub-Saharan Africa have mobile phones. The ability to tie into a distribution system that Alibaba has built, where they can figure out what their products are and design them and not have to worry about how you can get them to the customer. Sitting in the Philippines here with a company like Aliala and all of its potential to create jobs for this young country, or as Igor has said, using technology not to replace jobs, but to continue to create jobs. And so we are excited about the fact that today was the best day for more than half the people in the world, and the facts are tomorrow will be the best day in history for more than half the people in the world. And I thank you for joining us, and I'd like to have Mike Clouden, CEO of the Institute, close this session.
I'd like to join you, have you join me, and I will join you in thanking two groups. I want us to thank our wonderful closing panel, but I want you to join me in thanking each and all of you collectively, because it is your participation here that has made this such an exciting event. So thanks to all of you, and thanks to the panel.